Hello, and welcome to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith. I'm the Ryan half of Ryan and Brian, and this is episode number 17. This week we are talking about symbolism in the Gospel of John. Both Brian and I read a book called Symbolism in the Fourth Gospel by Craig Koester. And so in this episode, we use that book as a framework to talk about the symbolism and images in the book of John. So it's kind of a book review, but not really a book review. Yeah. Anyway, it's all good. We talk about how some individuals are representative of larger groups, the pairing of stories contrasting light and dark, and a myriad of other things. That book really opened up my eyes to see and understand what John may have been trying to communicate, and I think you'll find it really interesting as well. Before we get started, if you're enjoying the podcast, would you mind leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or a review on Facebook? If that's not your thing, then would you just mind sharing the post about this episode or another episode you've enjoyed on Facebook or Instagram, or, just go out and tell your friends. That works too. We'd love to expand our audience. With all that said, let's jump right into this episode discussing the symbolism in the Gospel of John. All right, Brian, you ready to do this?
I think I am.
Yes. All right, so today we're going to talk about a book.
Yep.
A book that's called Symbolism in the Fourth Gospel. And how do you pronounce the author's name? I'm going to mess it up.
Koester. It's Craig Koester.
I didn't want to say Koester.
Well, you could say
Craig Koester, but it's Koester.
That's how I would say it. It's probably originally would have been O with an umlaut over it, but I think it's Koester. I think, the Anglicism, well, never mind. Yeah, Symbolism in the Fourth Gospel is, and so that's the book we're going to talk about. I was thinking, well, you go ahead.
Yeah, well, so I think we should talk about why I read this book.
Okay.
And then maybe why you read this book.
Okay.
So, we've talked about John, because that's a big area of study for you.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time on John.
Yeah, and I was just a lowly undergrad and doing other things as a music ministry major. And
chasing Lauren.
That's true. Very true. And, so I was in all these classes, and so I didn't study as much. And so as we talked about some of the stuff in John, it's kind of like, Brian, how do I attain some of this knowledge that's in your brain? And so you recommended, one of the books I pick up is Symbolism.
This is the first I recommended to you on the Gospel of John. Is that right or not?
It is. Okay. It is the first one you recommended.
Yeah, so you're kind of like, well, what would be a good book? Kind of so we could, and when we have these discussions on the Gospel of John, that you would have a little bit more insight and that kind of thing. And yeah, so that was the first one I thought of. I was thinking we're doing this book discussion today, and a lot of podcasts, we don't want to be like every other podcast. A lot of them discuss current books. We decided to do one that's almost 20 years old.
Yeah, so we're not like those other guys. So old books.
So anyway, yeah, you said that, and this was one of the first books that came to mind, and I think I told you I debated. Koester wrote this book, and then he wrote a later one called The Word of Life, Theology of John's Gospel. I think it's a subtitle, A Theology of John's Gospel, something along those lines. I should look that up.
Just talk.
They're very similar in a lot of ways. The Word of Life is a newer book, and we'll even talk about this a little bit. Koester, the way he chooses to arrange his material, it does get a little bit repetitive.
Mm-hmm.
If you read, I don't think there's any need to read both of these books, but, I guess I didn't even think about it when I had you read this one first, but it certainly was, I don't want to say this, instrumental in the way that I read the Gospel of John. I found myself, when I read it first, agreeing with him a lot, but it also gave me some insight into, well, I think one particular insight that just completely changed, kind of flipped my understanding of the Gospel of John in a lot of ways. So it was a crucial book for me, and so that's why I kind of suggested it for the first one for you to read on this. So what'd you think about it?
I thought it was very interesting.
Right.
We kind of texted like, hey,
sure.
There's some stuff in here that's kind of, I got some questions about this. And so like for me, it was really interesting to think about with the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I just read those as narratives.
Right.
And then realizing they are. Yeah. And then like you can get in the book of John that it is a narrative, but there's a lot of imagery in it as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think I'd approach John just like I'd approach the other Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Right. Okay.
Which I don't know. You're looking at me.
No, I wasn't looking at you crazy. I was just thinking about what you're saying. So yeah, I at some point we do need to talk about the difference between the synoptics and John. But here's the interesting thing for me about narrative, doing a narrative approach to the Gospels is I think what you're always asking me about, well, how can I get some of this stuff? How did I miss some of these kind of connections?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what we're trying to do here.
Right.
And I think for me, the narrative really helps, because what you begin to realize is, and I'm going to say this, I don't know exactly if I can say this well, but I think a lot of times we look at the gospel writers as though they simply kind of just dictated what happened,
Mm-hmm.
but they were very thoughtful in the events that they chose. All of them talk about, there are other things that were written. And, John specifically says, if I wrote everything that Jesus did, the world couldn't contain the books, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he says, I selected these things. I think that it shows arrangement, that he arranged them particularly for a particular purpose. We can maybe give an example or two of that later on. And I think that's true of all four Gospels. Now, John is the outlier. I mean, John is different, but I think all four of them, I think when we read them narratively, it begins to shed light on it. And again, one of these days, we need to talk about the synoptics themselves and how do we read those, because some people want to compare them always. They always want to lay Matthew and Mark side by side and look at the same account in both, which you can learn a lot by doing that. But then you also have to go back and say, why does Mark choose to give us this particular account in the way that he does? Right.
Right.
And I think you can learn a lot. And we'll maybe give examples again of some things that John says that's really unique. I mean, literally unique in the New Testament, in the Bible, and some other things. So anyway, I think that's what we're talking about.
So I thought it was a really good book. And as we get into this, I want to kind of talk about what he said as a symbol in this.
Okay.
And so this is his definition from the book. A symbol is an image, an action, or a person that is understood to have transcendent significance.
Right.
In Johannine terms, symbols span the chasm between what is from above and what is from below.
Right. Because Jesus, I mean, he's quoting there the Gospel of John, quoting Jesus in the Gospel of John, where he says, you are from below, but I am from above. The thing is, the people he's talking to there are not understanding what he's saying. And so Jesus is using these symbols and this imagery in a way that they can't understand. But then, Koester's point is that the author of the Gospel of John does the same thing. John uses these symbols. Now, here's what I think is important, and I always point this out when I suggest this book to someone, is because something's symbolic does not mean it's not real. Okay? In U.S. history, for example, George Washington plays a very important role for us, right? We call him the father of the nation, which is a symbolic way, a metaphoric way to talk about his role. And there's a way that he functions symbolically in our worldview. That's another thing we'll come to in another time. But he has a function symbolic in that. But that doesn't mean he wasn't real. It doesn't mean that the things that he really crossed the Potomac. He really did the chopping down the cherry tree supposedly was false. But you get what I'm saying is even though he was a historical figure that really lived, we could go find his bones today. I suppose. Even though that's the case, he does have this kind of larger than life role in a way. And so John does this with these accounts. He uses them in order to teach and to kind of show us what Jesus was teaching, really, I think, in a lot of ways. So, yeah.
Yeah. But one of the things in the first third of the book, which is he talks about representative figures. And so one of the things that really stood out to me is talking about like people who meet Jesus.
Right.
And talking about this, you spoke earlier about how John, when he wrote this, chose things very specifically in a specific order. And so one of the things that the first sections he talks about is Nicodemus.
Right.
And then
chapter 3,
and then it's the woman at the well in chapter 4. Mm-hmm. What was interesting to me as he was making the point in this book is that the language in both of these cases, he's making the case that these people were representative of another people.
Okay, of a larger group.
Of a larger group,
right?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think you see that. I think Nicodemus. Well, there's a couple of things I think you're wanting to talk about here, but the representative figures, I find those two very fascinating, and I would always do this in class. In fact, I'll say to the listener, this might be something you want to stop and do. It's very interesting to read Nicodemus, the account of Nicodemus in chapter 3. And then the account of the woman at the well in chapter 4. And I used to have my students do this when I was teaching the Gospel of John, and I would have them note all of the similarities and all of the differences that they notice in those two accounts.
Yes.
And this is an example when you talk about arrangement. I think that John has intentionally laid these two side by side in order to say something about who it is that really begins to understand Jesus and who it is that's missing the point about who Jesus is. You might remember Nicodemus was a leader of the Jews. And gosh, we don't have time to talk about that right now, but the word is in Greek is eudaioi, the word that we translate as Jews. Some people translate as Judeans, eudaioi, right? It's the people of the place of Judea. And you know, I'll just say this, that when we use the term Jew in the first century, we've talked about this in some other places. First of all, it's not talking about a monolithic, like one belief kind of group. But the other thing is it's not the same that we would use that word today. And so I think we have to be very careful there. There's some who've accused, for example, John of being anti-Semitic because of the way that he talks about the Jews as the enemies. And I'll say in a horrible way, the Gospel of John was used during the time leading up to the Nazi regime in Germany, before that period of time, and through it to essentially justify some of the atrocities against the Jewish people in that period of time. But when John uses this, we've got to really ask ourselves the question, who's he referring to? So here's Nicodemus, the leader of the Jews, and you might remember later on during their discourse, and again, it's one of these back and forth. John loves discourses. In Matthew, Jesus speaks, right?
Yes.
I don't know if you can just flip through the Gospels and see this. If you flip through the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Luke, if you have a red letter Bible, there are these large sections of red. But if you flip through the Gospel of John, I always say it's red, black, because Jesus is in these discussions with people. John is recording discourses. And so he gets into this discourse with Nicodemus. And one of the interesting things he says, you're a teacher of Israel and you don't understand these things. And so there's an irony there. There's, that's another thing that I think John is using is irony. Here's another thing that you got to think. Here's a leader of the Jewish people who comes to Jesus and calls him rabbi, which is a huge word in the Gospel of John. Rabbi is a word that is full of meaning and this kind of thing. And so that whole thing you need to read in that way. But now when you talk about them as representative characters, what's interesting is that many times the Gospel of John, you see a character switch from the singular to the plural.
Yes. This was one of the things that really stuck out to me.
Yeah.
In this.
Yeah. And this is one of those examples when you're always asking, making fun of me about Greek and that kind of thing.
I'm not making fun of you. I'm just saying I know nothing.
This is one of those things. Here's a problem we have in English. I'll go on a rant about this another day.
Okay.
We used to have two different words for, I'm going to get a little grammatical here. Okay. Get ready for everybody. So we used to have two different words for the second person pronouns in English for the singular and the plural. Okay. You and ye, or thou and thee, were a way for us to talk about plural and singular, but we have collapsed those into one. And so we simply say you, and I say, unless you're part of my wife's people. My wife is from Eastern Kentucky, and she makes these things very clear, or Eastern Tennessee would be a similar, maybe Virginia, I don't know. But in most parts of the United States, when we say you, well, I guess Cincinnati is yous, but we use the word you for both singular and plural. So if I say, are you coming to, okay, we're having dinner tonight, Ryan, are you coming? If I'm saying, are you and Lauren coming? Or if I'm saying, are you coming? I say it the same way. Are you coming? Now, my wife's people use the distinction, all y'all, for plural, which is helpful.
It is helpful.
And, if it's interesting, this is one of those examples, if you read the King James Version, you can still tell the difference between singular and plural. But John, you'll have people say, you'll have Nicodemus talking along, and then, in fact, at the beginning of his discourse, if I recall correctly, I'm not looking at it, I probably should, but he says something to the effect, we know that you are a teacher who's come from God, right? Doesn't he say something like that, or sent from God? And so he uses the plural there. So he's speaking not only for himself, but he's speaking on behalf of other people as well. And what's really interesting is when Jesus answers, he says, we know about those things that we have seen. And so, especially the Gospel of John, and I don't know exactly what to do with this. I have some suspicions, but especially in the Gospel of John, verbs that have to do with knowing or seeing or thinking, testifying, all are usually in the plural. So we know, for example. And so that's, I think, what you're talking about when you have these representative, Nicodemus isn't just speaking for himself, if you will, but he's kind of representing others who are similar to him. Now, that could be Jewish leaders, or it could be later in chapter 12 of the Gospel of John. There's a specific reference to those who believed in Jesus. Again, I'm doing this off the top of my head, but many, even among the Jewish leaders, believed in him. This is the last half of John chapter 12, 37 or something like that. He says, even many among the Jewish leaders believed in him, yet they would not do so publicly because they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God, something to that effect. Send in your letters of correction later on, but he could be representing those Jewish leaders. And he's kind of coming to Jesus to ask him these questions that he has about what. And it's funny because Jesus answers a question. When I'm teaching this, I always say Jesus answers a question that's never asked here. Because Nicodemus never gets around to asking a question. Then Jesus starts talking about what's necessary in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, which is the only place, by the way, in the Gospel of John, one of the few places I'd have to look. But the kingdom language is not very big in the Gospel of John. Eternal life is, but kingdom's very seldom used, but it is used here. So he begins to answer that question. I have another suspicion. It's kind of a weird suspicion about the Nicodemus, but we'll talk about that another time maybe. But
your weird suspicions, we'll talk about those another time.
Well,
we don't have, let's not talk about it.
There's no way to prove this, okay?
Oh, well, we were going to do another time.
Oh, it's not long enough to do a whole episode on.
Talk.
So you remember this other character we have in the Synoptic Gospels called the rich young ruler?
Yes.
So here you have a ruler of the Jews and this rich young ruler. And of course, what was the rich young ruler's question? What must I do
to be saved?
All right, or to obtain eternal life, right? Or to enter the kingdom of heaven. And so Jesus answers here the question that the rich young ruler asked. It makes me wonder if Nicodemus, if there's some connection here, if they're the same person or something along those lines. I don't know. Anyway, that's, like I said, there's no way to prove that. That's just no extra charge for that. That's just something I'm throwing out there. But then you have the Samaritan woman, where you have a very similar kind of context.
And that's, kind of ties back to when we talked about John 14. We already kind of talked about this, about where are they going to worship, that it started with this. And this is one of the things he brings up in the book. It usually starts with a theme. It starts with an individual, an individual opening a question, and then the context moves larger and larger and larger. So it moved from just, she is a Samaritan and Jesus is a Jew. Then it moved into her personal life.
Right.
Kind of context moved a little bit larger. Then it was about where do we worship? Right. And then as you pull in the townspeople, then as she runs back and says, right, he's here, the Messiah is here, and and they've crowned him king of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that she's representative, and the Samaritan people are representative of the world.
Right.
That it's not just a story of her, but it's a story about her in the context. She's symbolizing, and those people are symbolizing something greater.
Just another example of what you're saying here is when she asked him that question about where should we worship, she uses the plural there. You Jews say the place we should worship is in Jerusalem and on Mount Zion. And, we, plural, worship on this mountain. Our fathers worshiped on this mountain. So there again is that idea of the plural. And she goes, and the whole village comes out to meet her. So this idea of the Samaritans and that Jesus is not simply coming to the Jewish people. Later on, king is used again. Of course, king is a word that's used in several contexts. Chapter 6, for example. But then I'm thinking of a case when he's before Pilate. Remember, and there's that whole question about, are you the king of the Jews? And
yes.
And Jesus doesn't say yes, because he says, really, I'm the king of all of those who are on the side of truth. It's a much bigger thing. My kingdom is not of this world, he says to Pilate. And so Pilate's like, aha, you are a king then. And Jesus says, well, you're right in saying I'm a king. In fact, for this reason, I came into the world, that all who are on the side of truth should listen to me, right? I came to testify to the truth. And so here's that, that, like you said, the larger context. So, yeah.
Yeah, so that was really interesting. And in the book, he goes through several other cases talking about the royal official from Capernaum coming to have the sick son. which is very interesting. The invalid, and just coming into some of this stuff. And one of the things he pointed out is there seems to be in the book of John, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I read this book just this last week, so I'm still processing.
Koester's book, right?
Yes, Koester's book.
You've read Gospel of John previously.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. That's true. Yes. So I'm still processing, correlating how I put all this together. But there's a lot in the Gospel of John about that believing without seeing. Without sight, that Jesus makes this comment like, you've seen all these miracles and still you don't believe. Chapter 12. And that there's a lot in the Gospel of John about believing without sight.
Right. Yeah. So the
blind man that was healed.
Right. Chapter 9. The purpose statement of the Gospel of John is in John chapter 20, verses 30 through 31. And John says, there are many other things that Jesus did. Listen to this, in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. So he says he did these things in their presence, right? They were witnesses to these things. But these have been written, he says, so that you might believe that, I would read it, that the Messiah is Jesus. And there's a reason in the Greek language that we would say that the Christ is Jesus. In other words, he's writing to people who are questioning, who is the Messiah? The temple's gone. We're not sure what's happening now. It seems like Rome has the upper hand. Basically, John says, I'm going to make the case that the Messiah is Jesus, none other than Jesus of Nazareth, right? So that you might believe that the Messiah is Jesus. Some translations will say Jesus is the Messiah or Jesus is the Christ, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So that's the purpose statement of the Gospel of John. Now, what's really interesting about that is it follows immediately. You remember what account is just before that?
I don't.
It's an account we call Doubting Thomas.
Yes.
So Thomas has said, and we don't connect this. And here's the reason: is if you go look in your Bibles now, most of your English translations are going to separate chapter 20, verses 30 through 31 from what comes just before it. Most of them are going to have a header there that talks something about, the reason John wrote or something like that, purpose statement of the gospel, something like that. But if you look at the account just before that of Thomas, twice already, Jesus has appeared, or I should say already once, Jesus has appeared to the 11. Well, technically the 10, right? Because Judas is gone now.
Thomas is not
present the first time. And so here are the 10. And the 10 come to Thomas and they say to him, we have seen Jesus. He's risen from the dead. And you know what Thomas says? We call him Doubting Thomas. I always say that's not the right word. He's disbelieving Thomas. Literally. So we have in English, if we want to negate something, we put an "un" in front of it, like
unless.
Yeah. Or I was going to say unfriend.
Yeah.
So whatever. We put an "un" to make it opposite. And you have a thing in Greek called the alpha privative. You put an A in the beginning of it. We do it in some English words that we've borrowed from the Greek. But anyway, the word to believe is pisteuo, to believe, and that's the verb in Greek is pisteuo. And here's what Thomas really says. He says, I will, and he uses apisteuo, I will never believe. He uses a strong form, may apisteuo. I will never believe unless I see for myself, unless I touch his hands, touch the nail prints in his hand, touch the thrust. Literally, he uses the word balo here. Thrust my hand in his side, the King James Version, which is a good translation there. Unless I see for myself, I will never believe. So Jesus appears to him. And he says to him, Thomas, see the nail prints in my hand. Thrust your hand in my side, right? Put your fingers in the nail prints in my hand. He basically, which is kind of a cool thing, Jesus says, I'll give you the evidence that you need in order to believe. And Thomas, of course, says, my Lord and my God. Immediately he responds. And then Jesus says this. He says, good, you believe now having seen. Blessed are those who will believe without having seen. And then John goes immediately into many other things Jesus did in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe. So here's the point. He's saying Thomas did not believe the testimony of his close friends, right? Even though here are 10 of his close, he's been wandering around Galilee and the Judean wilderness with them for 3 years now, perhaps. It'd be one thing, right, Ryan, if one person came to you and said, hey, I saw someone who raised from the dead. If one of your friends, you might think, it's a prank, right? Or if two of them, what if 10 of your closest friends came to you and says, yes, we saw him. He is risen from the dead. You know, at some point, your disbelief is going to be, how to say this, it's going to be something that you're doing, right?
Right.
You know, unless you think all your friends are getting together to pull a pretty elaborate prank, which this one would be, to be frank, in poor taste, right? We've
Yes.
seen Jesus. You know, he's risen from the dead. You know, got you, Thomas.
World's worst joke
right?
ever.
But here's 10 of his closest friends telling him, we've seen Jesus raised from the dead. And yet Thomas, he doesn't just say, oh, I don't believe. He says, I will never believe unless I see for myself. So basically what John is doing, and this I think helps overall. And I know we're getting away from the book discussion, but
It's good though. It's
but
good.
I think what he's doing is he's really saying, you guys, Jesus is calling you blessed if you believe in him on the basis of the testimony of these people who saw these things themselves. They were there. We were present, you know, especially John. He puts himself present. We'll talk about this another day, the beloved disciple and what role that plays. Koester talks about that, the role of the beloved disciple as an ideal character. So here's what, I'm going to tell you this. Did you have anything you wanted to say in response to that? Or any questions?
Well, I was going to say some Greek, but you've got another thought in your mind, so go ahead and run with it. I'll just set this one out.
Before I forget it.
Yeah.
I thought I might say why Koester's, you know, I didn't even think about this actively when I told you should read this book first, but Koester's book was pretty important for me. I don't know that it was the most important early book on the Gospel of John that I read, but it was a pretty important one. And I can remember reading it. And in fact, I was looking over my copy. I have a hard copy. You know, this is back when we used to have hard copies of books. And I was looking at it, and I think I read it 3 times, you know, judging by the underlining. And at the one of the things I try to do in the back of the book, usually there's a fly leaf or whatever. I usually try to write my thoughts. And so 3 different times I wrote some different notes about what he did. And I think this book was pretty important about how I approach the Gospel of John. Now, there are other books on reading the Gospel of John as narrative that I looked at before this one. But there was something about Koester's presentation that really helped me catch a hold of it. Now, I told you, Koester's not a commentary. So if you're looking for...
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that I kind of appreciated about it as well. You know, we talked about it getting a little repetitive, but he puts it thematically, breaks things up. And it's, you know, if you ever are considering reading this, it's an easy read.
It is.
I am, as you know, I'm not a Greek scholar.
Right.
You know, I don't know all these... some of the technical pieces of this, but it's a pretty clearly explained position.
Yeah.
You know, looking at the scripture, looking at talking about the different aspects of it. And the reason it is repetitive, because just like as you were talking about again, like when you're talking about Nicodemus and the woman at the well, that there are differences in the people that are talking. But one of the things he also talks about is Jesus says he's the light of the world. Right. And talking about the imagery of dark and light. And so in another section of the book where he's talking about the imagery of dark and light, he comes back to the Nicodemus and the woman at the well, like Nicodemus came at night. Woman at the well is during the day.
Well, noon, right?
Noon, like
sixth hour.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, that's one of the contrasts you find between those two things. So yeah, that's what I was going to say is you get the, and it's funny, you said repetitive, and in the back of my book, I was, like I said, I tried to write some notes, and one of the words was this, he is somewhat repetitive. And the reason, but it's for the purpose, he's really tracing themes. If he had gone verse by verse, you wouldn't have the repetition, but you also, I think, would miss some of the connections that he draws out. And that's what I really like. You begin to see why John, again, as narrative, is writing with these themes in mind, with these different connections. We've talked about the temple theme, and we'll talk about it again, I'm sure, in the Gospel of John, but the theme of light and darkness, the use of characters, all of these are different ways that, there are different themes that John uses in what he's doing. And he really, I think, really highlights those well. And, I use this in undergraduate. I would use this for sophomores or juniors, that kind of thing, with no problem. And, most of them really appreciated the book. Found some real insights. Maybe in a minute, I'll tell you, I think there was one big insight that I received from this book. Then I'll come back to that in just a minute. One that's really changed the way that I think about the Gospel of John. But what else are you going to say about the book?
Yeah, for me, I mean, it also gives some helpful background information as we talking about, some of the things for me is talking about some of the feasts that have happened. Again, I think one of the things that was really profound for me is talking about the imagery of the light and talking about the Feast of Booths.
Yeah.
And that
tabernacles or booths. I
booths,
always pronounce that very. I always overpronounce booths because there was one time I was teaching the Gospel of John and I got on the test, somebody said the Feast of Booze.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm always,
that's a totally different feast.
That's a very different feast. Not that there was not some booze consumed at tabernacles, but it is a feast of booths. Booths. Because they would build these tabernacles or these booths that they would go, it's a fall festival.
And it's about them coming out of the wilderness. That God led them out of the wilderness. And one of the things is that in the evening, in the temple, they would light very bright lamps.
4 different lamps, according to
burning the undergarments of the priests.
According to Josephus, they would basically, the way Josephus described it is every square in Jerusalem would be made like daylight. These were such big candles that were burned.
And the temple was reflecting the light coming out. Right. And it's in that context that Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And so like the imagery that a Jew would have, or anyone that knew cultural context, like they would have said, like Jesus is juxtaposing himself to this. Oh, this is light, and Jesus is saying, no, I am the light of the world. He's the torch that's lighting everything.
Exactly right. And so again, the temple. So you get the temple there, right?
Yes,
because that's what they're looking to for the light. You said the wilderness wanderings. You'll remember the story in Exodus, Numbers, that as the tabernacle moved, right? The tabernacle, later the temple, as the tabernacle moved, God's glory was seen in a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of smoke by day. So that's what they're recreating in doing this.
Yes,
and Jesus is using that imagery. And again, it's not like that's some kind of hidden thing. You're always talking about how could I have seen this? But
yes, I'm like a crotchety old man. Why did you tell me about this when I was?
But the imagery is there for someone who would have been familiar. And again, I think he's writing. I think John is writing not long after the destruction of the temple, when this would have still been a living memory in people's minds. And I think he's primarily writing to people who are wondering, what do we do now that the temple's gone? So who would that be? Right? That's the people who went there to worship. I think that's who he's writing for. And so when, they would have, these are people when he talks about tabernacles would have the same way if I talked about a Thanksgiving feast to you. Now, if I was teaching in, I don't know, Ghana, I might have to explain what a Thanksgiving feast is, right? But if I just started a story with, it was one Thanksgiving and, this happened, from your experience, you would think, sights and sounds and smells. I mean, John did not have to explain all that because that would have been in their living memory. So that's, when I talk about us spending time learning culture and history, the culture and history and language of the first century, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about because, that's the kind of images that they would have had in their mind. So go ahead.
Yeah, some of those things. And then, we talked about this, I think, in the intertestamental about Feast of Dedication, which is also Hanukkah. And that's when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And shepherd is an image of a leader. And so, I think those were really instructive for me. We'd already talked about the shepherd piece, but going back and reading some of this and seeing some of these, again, that there's these contrasts, that there's very intentional, that Jesus is making things very intentional, and when he's saying things and what's going on in the context. And so I think for me, this book was really opened up John a little bit to be read and to see those things. Because I think it's sometimes we're just reading what did Jesus say? But there's, again, we always come back to this nuance. How did he say it? What did the word, it's all, when we moved from you to all y'all.
Right.
That was one of the things I told you and you're like, you're not going to like this. I think he does this a lot.
Right.
When I said why isn't it not all you all in all the spots? And so, you just said you're not going to like this because that happens a lot because it's blown it up. And so I really enjoyed the book. I think there's some things, I don't know if you want to talk about the community thing. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So one of the things that Koester does do that I kind of disagree with, and this is actually a pretty big deal. I don't know how important this is to people, but here's the thing I'll say. If you pick up a commentary, I always say this when I'm teaching the Gospel of John, if you pick up a commentary on the Gospel of John that was written anywhere between the mid-1970s up to around 2000, more than likely you're going to get a large discussion in the introduction on what they call the Johannine community. I don't know if it'd ever be worth us talking about why that's the case, but there was a really influential book, a book that I think had too much influence, in my opinion, by a guy by the name of John Lewis Martin, that dealt with this idea. He called it History and Theology of the Fourth Gospel is the name of his book, and it was hugely influential. But one of the things that he said is that we really don't have in the Gospel of John a story about Jesus. What we have is a story about a later community they call the Johannine community. In other words, a community of Christians that lived in the later part of the first century who are reading their own community history back into the life of Jesus. So in these places where they use the plural, for example, like you've been talking about, that's why Jesus doesn't say, I know the things that I have seen. He says, we know the things we've seen, because Jesus represents, in these commentators' minds, the Johannine community. So again, the problem I always had with that is that makes the Gospel of John not not historical in any kind of normal sense of that word. I know there are some people who'd quibble with my use of normal sense of that word, but this idea that it's not about Jesus at all, but it's really about this community of believers. And it gets ridiculous. There's one commentary in particular that I always use as the height of this, where every story becomes a stage in the life of the Johannine community. So the story of the Samaritan woman, well, there's a period of time that the Johannine community had to leave Judea because of persecution, and so they lived in Samaria for a period of time, and that's what that story is about. It's just,
Yes.
It just gets to this. So what really became ridiculous is that there's this point at which you begin to say, you can tell me about the history of this community that there's no evidence for other than what you're reading from the text, or you're extrapolating here. There's no evidence for this community, and you can tell me more about the history of that than you can what the Gospel of John actually purports to say. And so there became kind of a backlash. Myself and some others, kind of around the turn of the century, turn of the last millennium, a little bit before, began to react against this. And so I think pretty much it's I don't know if it's been completely rejected, but I would say it's not nearly as common as it was for those 30 years. I think there was some particular things that derailed kind of the whole understanding of the Gospel of John for that period of time among scholars, at least. In fact, I think I told you I wrote a chapter once about this that I kind of titled "The Emperor Has No Clothes." Right? It's like you guys are building these elaborate theories on these really minuscule pieces of evidence. So anyway, Koester does have a little bit of that in there. He's not as bad as some, but I pretty much I don't necessarily accept that. I kind of reject that, and not only myself but others and some good writers now, good thinkers on the Gospel of John, much better than I, who've kind of moved in a way that I think is more helpful than understanding the Johannine community. So the only reason I say that is if you pick up a commentary, just be careful about that kind of stuff. There's some really good commentaries out there they're good commentaries in other ways, but they still have that problem.
Well, maybe we should make a list of like good commentaries.
Sure. Yeah, it'd be good sometime. We could probably put it on a website or something. So that'd be a good idea.
So we've kind of talked around some of the themes that are in the book, and I just want to kind of give like maybe my closing thoughts on what I think about I think it's a great book.
Right.
I think it's a book that if you've studied scripture and you've hopefully you've read the Gospel of John, if you're listening to this, if you haven't, go read it. Yeah. But I think it's a good book. Like if you're wanting to go a little bit deeper level into the Gospel of John, I think it will help you maybe make some connections in there to think about it. And I think, as you kind of alluded to this, and we had a phone call about this, and I said, Brian, is this like what I call like a Gnostic knowledge? Like it's this hidden knowledge. And as you kind of alluded to, it's like, no, this was written in a particular context and people would have made these connections.
Absolutely.
We're just on the outside of that. We're 2,000 years on the other side of it. And so I think this book helps tie back into some of that cultural context, into some of that imagery that they would have seen in that. And so it's not one you're going to find at Barnes & Noble or are there Berean bookstores anymore? I don't think so. Yeah.
Not that I know of.
Yeah. Anyway, so I found mine on Amazon. You can find it on Christian Books. It's about $32. It's also it's not a cheap book.
Right. Did they have a Kindle version, or do you know?
That's a great question. I like the hard copy. Well,
you can look. Look it up.
We'll put a link to it in there. But I think it's a great book if you're interested in the Gospel of John and seeing some of the the nuance that's in there that you may not just see otherwise.
Yeah, and kind of an introductory level, kind of approach to it too. So, I was going to say, I said I was going to say one thing about what I found particularly helpful is really this. Koester was the first one to introduce me to this idea of misunderstandings in the Gospel of John, and the purpose that they serve. And it's a theme, right? There are almost everything Jesus says to a group or an individual, they misunderstand. So let me give you some examples. John 2, he's in the temple. You kind of understand why, but right. Yes. He says, destroy this temple. I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And they're all like, it's taken us 46 years to build this temple. Right.
They said it just like that.
It's taken us 46
Why? Wise guy.
And of course, John says for the reader, he takes us, and so here's the point: misunderstandings in the Gospel of John always take us to a deeper level of understanding, and we kind of become insiders there, right? So he says, kind of takes us aside. John does if we're using we say the narrator takes us aside, and he says to us, he was talking about the temple of his body. And we're like, because we know the outlines of Jesus' life at this point. I think this is written for people who knew the general outline of the life of Jesus, and I can show you a couple examples why another day. But he says he was talking about his body, and we're like, oh, okay, I get it. And then later, the woman at the well, he says, I can give you water to drink that you'll never thirst again. And they're sitting there by a well, right? Mm-hmm. And he's like, oh, she's like, are you greater than? No, she didn't say the same way. She said, are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well? You've got this well's deep, and you've got nothing to draw from, right? And so she's thinking physical water. And that's the misunderstandings are typically that Jesus is talking about a spiritual. He's using a symbol or an image, and they're taking it literally, right? Mm-hmm. And so he's like, no, the water that I give, is a different kind. It's about eternal life, right? Nicodemus. In chapter 3, you remember that? He said, unless a man is born, and there's a play on words here that I can't really spend time on right now, but anathen, from above or again. And Nicodemus immediately says, well, how can I enter a second time into my mother's womb and be born, right? Mm-hmm. And so he's thinking physical birth, and Jesus says, no, I'm talking about spiritual birth. He says, the spirit moves where it wills. He uses wind, in fact, kind of there. And so all of these different times, chapter 6, the bread of life stuff, where he says, I am the bread that's come down from heaven. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. And they're like, what? It's like, what are you talking about?
Things are going weird here.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Well, you got to remember that's in verse 66 there. It says many disciples turned back and no longer followed him because of how difficult this teaching was, right? So there are these misunderstandings, and Koester was the first one to show me that really what he's doing is he's kind of elevating people's understanding. The reader is going, oh, okay, I get what he's saying here. It's taking us into another level of understanding. The bread's
another level.
Exactly. And so that was huge in thinking about the Gospel of John differently and noticing those kind of things, the misunderstandings. And a lot of people have written on the misunderstandings, but Koester was really, for me, the first one that I read that really, really brought that home and made me see just the Gospel of John a whole different way. And so I'll always kind of be grateful to him for that. Now, let me respond a little bit to what you said about, and this will kind of bring this idea of symbol too. You said, that we're reading this thing that is written in a different culture, different history, different time. Just to give another example, so I think it was Umberto Eco. I can't remember who. One of the people who write on linguistics talked about this, that we have to be equal to reading a book, right? So there are certain requirements for us to read a book. It's even true of Shakespeare, right? Now Shakespeare wrote in English of a form, right? But we're separated. Yeah. We're separated from him culturally and those kind of things. We can understand Shakespeare, though, but it takes a little work. And even if you read Shakespeare, who wrote in our language, and he's much closer to our own time than, let's say, the time of the scriptures. Mm-hmm. We usually need to look at the footnotes, right, to see kind of what's going on there. He uses words that we no longer use. He uses some forms. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. We have to do a little bit of digging, a little bit of work to really understand what's going on in Romeo and Juliet, for example, this kind of thing. And so it's the same with, Goethe or Faust or whomever we're reading, right? Mm-hmm. We have to think about language and culture and history. And it's no different than the Bible. And let me say one more thing then about symbol. Another day, we're going to talk about worldview. We've used the term worldview before. The way I understand worldview, symbol is an important aspect of that. A symbol, so you heard earlier Koester's definition of a symbol. I would say a symbol is a visible representation of a belief, is one of the ways to put it. It's some visible, or, for him, it's kind of a literary sign that points toward something else, kind of stands in place of that other thing. So flags are symbols. Most countries have symbols like eagles, for example, or if you look at a dollar bill, there are symbols all over it,
Illuminati.
Great.
There's something on the back of the
Well, now this podcast just got flagged. So
oh, God.
There's the all-seeing eye.
The all-seeing eye, man. And I saw National Treasure.
Yeah,
I saw Nicolas Cage. Blew all that open.
I'll tell you one time why National Treasure was ruined for me. But anyway, the pyramid, the words there, Novum Seclorum, all these kind of things are symbols. And even the dollar bill, some people point out, is a symbol itself. If you go to Washington, D.C., the Washington Monument, Abraham Lincoln, the Lincoln Memorial, all these are symbols. So that's one of the aspects of a worldview. When we talk about worldview, I think symbol has an important place. And I think that's another reason this book is important. It helps us see a part of the worldview of the people who were listening to this book in the first century. The very first readers, we would say, or listeners probably, it's probably being read to them. They were listening for these cues. They were thinking about, again, their own history and their own culture. Shepherd for them would be not something they'd have to look up on Wikipedia. That would be, they would know, George down the street who's a shepherd, not a very good shepherd, but so those kind of symbols, I think, help get us into the culture. So that's the only other thing I was going to say about that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. Again, back to the book, Symbolism in the Fourth Gospel. Good stuff.
I would read it. Yeah.
Yeah, read it.
Yeah.
Or 3 times. Or just listen to this podcast. We just basically gave you everything.
Well, I don't know. There's a lot more there.
Yeah, it's a joke, Brian. Yeah. Joke. Anyway, check out the book. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. Next week, Brian and I are talking about all of the Gospels, not just John. That's right, we're talking about all of them. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you haven't noticed, they all tell the story of Jesus, but in a little bit different ways. That Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot of similarities, and John is a little bit different. And so we explore the similarities and differences in the Gospels and how we should understand and think about those differences. We hope you'll join us for that conversation. You can find show notes, links, and more at thebiblebistro.com, as well as sign up for our email newsletter to stay in touch, but also to get some exclusive content we are working on. Yes, we are working on exclusive content just for those who sign up to our newsletter. So if you're listening to the podcast, I'm assuming you like what we're saying or what Brian's saying. I'm just flavor in there. But we're producing some stuff, and so we think you'll like it. So go ahead to our website and sign up for that email newsletter. You can find us and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at The Bible Bistro. And as always, you can subscribe to us on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You just need to search for Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. Thanks so much for listening. We will talk to you next Tuesday.